What would make an experienced wind farm technician lock every door around him and still not feel safe? In today's video, you'll meet someone who found out the hard way that isolation plays tricks on the mind until the threat becomes too real to ignore. But before we begin, please subscribe and drop a like. That means a lot to me. Comment below where you're listening from. Now take a deep breath, lock your doors, and let's get into it. My name is Marcus, and I used to maintain the big commercial wind turbines out in the Nebraska Panhandle. You know the ones. They look like clean white pinwheels from the interstate, but up close, they are towering industrial monoliths standing 300 feet tall. It takes a solid 20 minutes just to climb the internal ladder to the nacelle, the bus-sized housing at the top. I had been pulling overtime for 3 weeks straight. My sleep schedule was shot, my hands ached constantly, and my diet consisted mostly of gas station coffee and stale sunflower seeds. So, when things started feeling wrong on Tower 42, I blamed my own exhaustion. It was mid-October. The corn had been harvested, leaving miles of flat, dead dirt stretching out in every direction. The sky was an unbroken sheet of flat gray clouds, and the air was dead still. Turbines don't spin on windless days, making it the perfect time for maintenance. I strapped into my harness, clipped onto the safety cable, and started the long climb up the dark steel tube of the tower. By the time I popped the top hatch and climbed out onto the roof of the nacelle, my muscles burned. You are on top of the world up there, tethered by a single lanyard, with nothing but open air between your boots and the dirt below. I set down my tool bag and got to work checking the anemometer sensors. That was when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, riding on a non-existent breeze. A sickly sweet metallic odor, like old pennies left soaking in a jar of rotting meat. We get dead birds up there sometimes, victims of the blades, but this was different. This smelled wet and ancient. I rubbed my eyes, assuming the lack of sleep was messing with my senses. Exhaustion does that. It makes you taste metal and smell things that aren't there. I popped a mint into my mouth and turned my attention back to the sensor housing. About 20 minutes later, I happened to glance over the edge of the fiberglass housing. Far below, near the base of the white steel tower, was a speck. My vision blurred for a second. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was a person. Someone was standing at the bottom of the turbine, looking straight up. Out here, on private leased farmland miles from any paved road, you don't get hikers. You don't get lost tourists. You just get emptiness. The figure wore no high-vis gear. From 300 feet up, details are vague, but I could tell their skin was pale. Stark white, like they were wearing no clothes at all. And their proportions were off. The arms hung too far past the waist. The posture hunched in a way that made my stomach do a slow, sickening roll. I looked away, gripping my wrench so hard my knuckles turned white. I figured it had to be some kind of optical illusion. A weirdly shaped piece of debris left by the farmers. Or maybe my sleep-deprived mind was projecting shadows onto the dirt. I just needed to focus. I told myself to tighten the next bracket. Just do the job. I ratcheted a bolt. Counted to 10. Then, despite my best efforts, I looked over the edge again. The figure had moved. It was no longer standing out in the dirt. It was pressed flat against the curved steel base of the tower. The head was tilted back at an extreme angle, staring up at the hatch I'd left open at the bottom. One long bone-white arm reached out and gripped the bottom rung of the external access ladder. A wave of vertigo washed over me, tilting the horizon. The sky felt too immense, pressing down on my shoulders, trying to push me off the edge. I could not fight the rising terror, but I also could not leave. The only way down was through the dark, narrow tube of the tower. If that thing went inside, I would be trapped at the top. I forced my shaking hands to just keep moving. If I kept working, I wouldn't have to think about it. I pulled out my torque wrench and moved to the yaw motor housing. Every turn of the wrench was a desperate attempt to build a wall between myself and whatever was on the ground. The metallic, rusted smell grew stronger, coating the back of my throat. I breathed through my mouth, refusing to look down again. I spent 45 minutes focusing on nothing but greased gears and steel threads. I hummed a random tune and bit my lip until I tasted blood, doing whatever I could to keep my mind occupied. I convinced myself that when I finally finished and looked down, the dirt would be empty. I torqued the final bolt. I packed my tools. I clipped my bag to my belt. I walked to the edge and looked down. The dirt around the base was empty. No pale figure. No weird shadows. Just miles of harvested corn stalks. Relief hit me so hard, I almost collapsed. I laughed out loud, calling myself a paranoid idiot. I had worked myself into a panic over nothing but a shadow and a lack of sleep. I opened the roof hatch and began the long descent inside the tower. The climb down is always faster, but the darkness inside the tube felt oppressive. The single string of emergency bulbs cast long, warped shadows across the curved steel walls. I kept my eyes focused on my boots, moving rhythmically from rung to rung. The smell was gone. The air was just dusty and stale. When my boots finally hit the bottom deck, I unclipped my harness with shaking hands. I pushed open the heavy steel base door and stepped out into the flat gray afternoon. The air was cold and clean. I walked briskly to my work truck parked a few yards away, tossed my gear into the bed, and climbed into the cab. I slammed the door and locked it. Safe, I sank back into the seat, the adrenaline slowly leaving my system. Just sitting in the quiet cab made me feel protected. I reached out and cranked the heater to chase away the lingering chill in my bones. The vents blew warm air across my face. I took a slow breath, then reached for the gear shift, ready to put the truck in drive. Right in the center of the windshield, directly in my line of sight, was a huge, greasy handprint. The fingers stretched far too long, the palm smeared with something dark. I stared at it, my hand hovering over the gear shift. The warm air from the heater hit the glass, and the overwhelming smell of rotting meat and old pennies filled the tight space of the cab. The handprint wasn't on the outside of the glass. It was on the inside. The wrench slipped from my gloved fingers. It struck the steel rail, sending a brief shower of orange sparks into the gloom before clattering onto the concrete ties. I stopped dead in my tracks. Down here, underneath the sleeping city, you learn to respect the quiet. I work maintenance for the transit authority, walking the subway tunnels during the dead hours between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. when the trains stop running. It is a lonely, dirty job. The air is always thick with brake dust, damp concrete, and the sour scent of stagnant water pooling in the drainage ditches. My flashlight beam cut a sharp cone through the pitch-black tunnel, illuminating the endless parallel lines of the tracks stretching ahead. The walls curved inward, tight and claustrophobic, caked in decades of grime. I bent down to pick up the wrench. As my fingers brushed the cold metal, a sound echoed from the darkness further down the tunnel. The noise sounded like a wet, dragging scrape. I stopped breathing. The sound was distinct. It wasn't the usual echo of settling concrete or dripping pipes. It sounded like a heavy sack of wet laundry being pulled across gravel. I stood up slowly, keeping my flashlight aimed forward. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded thin and pathetic, swallowed by the endless, heavy dark. No answer. Up above, on the street level, a late-night freight truck rumbled over a grate. The vibration shook dust from the tunnel ceiling, raining down in the beam of my light. During the rumble, the scraping sound stopped. I tightened my grip on the wrench. Down here, you have to keep your head straight to avoid panicking at every creak and groan. I assumed a stray dog had wandered down from the platform above. Or maybe one of the tunnel dwellers, dragging a trash bag full of cans. There are miles of forgotten cross passages down here. People get lost, trash gets moved. It was a simple, harmless explanation. I took a step forward. My heavy work boot crunched against the ballast stones. A second later, from somewhere in the tunnel, came the exact same crunch. I stopped. The darkness stopped. I took another step. Crunch. 1 second passed. Then, from somewhere close in the dark, a single answering crunch echoed back, followed immediately by that thick, sluggish drag. My throat went dry. Whatever was out there wasn't just moving. It was matching my pace. It was mimicking the cadence of my footsteps, waiting exactly 1 second after I moved to take its own step. The tunnel felt like it was shrinking. The curved walls seemed to press inward, stealing the oxygen from the air. I wanted to turn and run back to the maintenance platform, but running down here is a death sentence. You trip on the third rail, you break an ankle on the ties, you die in the dark. I decided to hold my ground. If it was someone messing with me, I would not give them the satisfaction of a chase. If it was an animal, loud noises and a bright light would scare it off. I planted my boots firmly on the wooden ties. I refused to take another step. "Transit authority," I yelled, trying to project authority. "Show yourself." Silence. The echo of my voice faded down the miles of tube. I waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. My legs began to cramp from standing so rigid. The damp cold of the underground seeped through my jacket. I kept the flashlight beam trained dead center on the tracks ahead. The battery was strong, throwing bright white light at least 50 yards before fading into the impenetrable black. Nothing moved. Whatever had been out there must have slipped away into a side tunnel while I was yelling. The mimicry had just been a coincidence of acoustics. Sound does strange things in these tubes. It bounces, delays, and distorts. I'd let the creepy environment get the best of me. Feeling a bit relieved, I lowered the flashlight slightly, letting the beam sweep the ground near my feet. As part of protocol, we wear a heavy nylon safety tether clipped to the back of our utility belts. It drags behind us, designed to catch on rail spikes if we slip near the high voltage lines. I glanced down at my tether, tracing the thick yellow rope as it trailed off behind me into the shadows I had just walked out from. Except the tether was pulled taut. I frowned, turning my body just enough to shine the light behind me. The beam traveled down the yellow rope, illuminating the grime-covered tracks I had already inspected. About 20 feet back, the tether did not end in a safety clip. It was tangled. Wrapped tightly in the nylon cord was a heavy, dark shape resting between the steel rails. I took one hesitant step backward. The rope slacked, then pulled tight again. A heavy, squelching scrape echoed in the tunnel. I focused the beam. The shape was a thick, industrial trash bag, torn open at the bottom. Dark, thick fluid was leaking from the tier, pooling onto the concrete ties. The horrifying reality finally dawned on me, freezing the blood in my veins. There had never been a stalker mimicking my steps. There was no one waiting in the dark ahead of me. The dragging sound I had been hearing, the heavy, squelching scrape that perfectly matched my pace, was coming from behind. I had hooked onto a body a mile back, and I had been dragging it through the dark this entire time. I live in rural Nevada. The roads out here do not really connect anything to anything. They just stretch across the scrub and the dirt until they vanish into the heat haze or the dark. My job is to maintain the painted lines on these highways. We do the work at night because the asphalt is too hot during the day, and the paint needs a specific temperature to cure right. I drive the striping truck. It is a slow, tedious job. You sit in the cab, going a steady 5 miles an hour for 10 hours straight, laying down the double yellow lines that keep people from drifting into oncoming traffic. The truck is enormous. The back is loaded with vats of yellow and white thermoplastic paint, heaters, and pressurized tanks full of tiny glass beads that drop onto the wet paint to make it reflective. As the driver, you have one job. You keep the steering wheel dead straight. There is a metal arm that sticks out from the front bumper with a laser pointer aimed at the old faded line on the road. You just keep the laser on the ghost line, and the computer handles the spray guns mounted behind the rear wheels. It was a Tuesday in early November. I was about 40 miles outside of Ely, working a stretch of highway that cuts through a huge, empty valley. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The only light came from my headlights and the halogen work lamps bolted to the sides of the truck. Around 2 in the morning, the cab felt too small. The heater was running, blowing dry air onto my shins, but a distinct chill started crawling up my spine. It was a sharp, prickly sensation, like static electricity pulling the small hairs on the back of my neck. I rubbed my skin, thinking the dry desert air was just causing static in my fleece jacket. I took a sip from my thermos and adjusted my grip on the steering wheel. I glanced at the small camera monitor mounted on the dashboard. The monitor shows a live feed of the paint gun spraying the road behind me. It is there so the driver can make sure the nozzles are not clogging. In the grainy black and white screen, the double yellow lines looked crisp and wet, rolling out endlessly onto the dark asphalt. The charge on my neck flared up again. It felt like a low-voltage current tracing the bumps of my spine. I shifted in my seat, trying to scratch the itch against the fabric. I looked out the side window into the dark. The sagebrush illuminated by my work, lights rolled past at a crawling pace. I checked the side mirror to make sure the glass beads were dropping evenly over the fresh paint. The mirror showed the side of the truck and the road trailing behind. The wet yellow line was not straight. About 20 feet behind the rear bumper, the freshly sprayed double yellow line took a sharp 90-degree turn. It veered off the asphalt, crossed the dirt shoulder, and zigzagged wildly into the dark sagebrush. I blinked and gripped the wheel tighter. The truck was moving straight. The laser guide on the front bumper was exactly aligned with the old faded paint. The computer said the guns were spraying normal. I looked at the dashboard monitor again. On the screen, the lines were straight. They followed the truck flawlessly. I looked back to the side mirror. In the glass, the lines were still shooting off into the desert, painting jagged patterns over the rocks and the dirt, stretching further and further away into the dark. It looked like a giant, frantic child had stolen a yellow marker and was scribbling across the landscape. The prickling sensation on my neck intensified. The pressure felt closer now, almost hovering just behind the headrest of my seat. I had a sudden, terrible urge to turn around and look into the sleeper cabin behind me. But I knew I was alone. The truck doors were locked. We were 40 miles from the nearest town. I shook my head, hoping it was just a trick of the light. The halogen work lights were casting strange shadows, where the side mirror was warped. Or maybe my eyes were just giving up after staring at a laser dot for 6 hours. If I focused on the rules of the job, I could ignore the weirdness. My trainer always drilled one rule into my head. Never stop the truck while the paint valves are open. If you stop, the pressurized guns will dump a gallon of boiling plastic onto the road in 3 seconds, creating a huge puddle that ruins the highway and takes hours to chip away. Professional protocol demanded I keep moving. Keep the wheel straight. Follow the laser. Do not deviate. I locked my eyes straight ahead. I watched the green laser dot crawl along the asphalt. I forced myself not to check the side mirror again. I ignored the monitor. The truck crept forward at 5 miles an hour. But out of the far corner of my vision, I could see the glow of the yellow paint in the mirror. It was doing things paint cannot do. It was spiraling. It was moving up the sides of invisible shapes in the dark. It was branching out like a root system across the desert floor, always staying just outside the throw of the work lights. The current on my neck grew so fierce my skin felt raw. The air in the cab smelled strongly of melting plastic and scorched wiring. I wanted to slam on the brakes. I wanted to bail out of the door and run into the dark. But running out here meant being alone in the total emptiness. The truck was my only source of light and heat. I turned the radio up as loud as it would go. I just needed the noise of the music to block out the sensation of something sitting in the dark space right behind my chair. I drove like that for 2 more hours. The tension in my shoulders turned into a dull, throbbing ache. The sensation never left my neck. Every time my eyes wanted to dart to the mirror, I forced them back to the green laser dot. Eventually, the radio crackled. The highway patrol dispatcher announced a wide load moving through the canyon ahead, meaning my shift had to pause. I saw the glowing signs of a remote truck stop approaching in the distance. The tall floodlights of the parking lot cut through the pitch black of the desert. I engaged the shutdown sequence for the paint guns. The computer confirmed the valves were closed. I pulled the huge truck into the empty gravel lot of the gas station and killed the engine. The sudden quiet was jarring. The static feeling vanished from my skin the moment the engine died. I sat in the dark cab for a long time, just breathing the stale air. I looked in the side mirror. The yellow lines on the road behind me were completely straight. They faded neatly into the distance, right where they belonged. I wiped my face with trembling hands. It had been exhaustion, just a side effect of staring at the road for too many hours in the dark. I grabbed my keys and climbed down from the cab. Every step felt incredibly heavy as I walked across the crunchy gravel to the brightly lit convenience store. The clerk was asleep behind the counter. I nodded to him, walked past the aisles of chips, and went into the small public bathroom. The bathroom smelled of cheap bleach and old cigarettes. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot. I looked exactly like a guy who had been driving a slow truck all night. I unzipped my thick fleece jacket and pulled it off, tossing it onto the wet counter. Underneath, I wore a standard gray t-shirt. The shirt felt stiff against my back. It stuck to my skin. I turned around and looked over my shoulder into the bathroom mirror. Starting from the base of my neck, running straight down my spine to the hem of my shirt, was a thick, wet line of reflective yellow paint. Hold still for me. We have about 20 minutes left on this series. I released the intercom button and leaned back in my chair. Working the overnight shift as an MRI technician is mostly an exercise in staying awake. The radiology department is buried deep in the basement of the hospital. There are no windows. The walls are lined with copper shielding to prevent outside radio waves from interfering with the magnetic field of the scanner. It feels like a bunker down here. You are isolated from the rest of the building, separated from the emergency room chaos and the quiet wards upstairs. The setup is simple. I sit in a small control room facing a computer terminal. A thick pane of leaded glass separates my room from the scanning suite where the machine sits. The scanner itself looks like a giant white donut. The patient lies on a motorized table that slides into the center of the donut. The machine makes a steady hammering vibration that penetrates the concrete floors. It is a loud, repetitive noise that eventually just fades into the background. My patient tonight was a guy in his late 50s. He was getting a routine scan of his lumbar spine. I had screened him for metal, given him earplugs, and slid him into the bore of the machine. The scanning room is kept dim to help patients relax, while my control room is brightly lit by fluorescent panels in the drop ceiling. About 5 minutes into the scan, the temperature in the control room started to drop. The temperature plummeted instantly. The air grew sharp and biting. I felt the chill seep through the thin fabric of my scrubs. My fingers grew stiff as I clicked the mouse to verify the image slices coming through the monitor. I rubbed my hands together, blowing warm air into my cupped palms. Hospitals are notorious for bad climate control. Maintenance is always tweaking the VX system, and the basement usually gets the worst of it. It was likely a stuck damper in the ventilation shaft, dumping raw air conditioning into my tiny room. I pulled a spare fleece blanket from the supply cabinet and draped it over my shoulders. I looked at the thick glass window to check on the patient. Because my room was bright and the scanning room was dark, the glass acted like a one-way mirror. I could see through to the white plastic of the scanner, but the surface of the glass also reflected the control room behind me. In the reflection, I saw my desk. I saw the door leading out to the hallway. I saw the empty rolling chair sitting in the corner by the supply cabinet. Only, in the reflection, the chair was not empty. Someone was sitting in it. I froze. My breath plumed in the freezing air of the room, creating a small cloud of mist in front of my face. I peered at the glass. The figure in the reflection was tall. It sat hunched over, its knees drawn up near its chest. Its gangly arms and legs folded awkwardly to fit into the small space of the chair. Its skin was the color of wet ash. It had no defining features, just a smooth, pale surface where a face should be. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the corner of my room. The rolling chair was empty. The corner was bare. I turned back to the glass. In the reflection, the gray figure was still there, sitting completely still. I suspected another equipment malfunction. The magnetic field of the MRI is incredibly powerful. It can pull a wheelchair across a room. Sometimes, it causes visual artifacts on monitors. I figured the magnetic field was messing with the polarized coating on the glass, creating a distorted shadow from the supply cabinet. The freezing temperature was just a broken vent. It was just a typical issue with bad hospital engineering. But the room kept getting colder. Frost began to form on the edges of my keyboard. My breath came out in thick, white clouds. The silence was driving me crazy. I had to hear a human voice to ground myself. I pressed the intercom button on the console. "Hey, Mr. Callahan, just checking in. You doing okay in there?" The intercom speaker pushed out static, then the patient's voice came through. "I'm fine." A little loud. "How much longer?" "About 15 minutes, I lied, reading the timer that clearly said 18. "Sorry about the noise. The weather outside is supposed to be nice tomorrow. They say it might hit 70 degrees. Good day for a walk." I babbled nervously into the mic, praying my voice wouldn't crack. I talked about traffic on the interstate. I talked about the bad coffee in the cafeteria. I kept my eyes glued to the computer monitor, too terrified to glance at the glass window. The sound of my own voice helped push back the rising dread. As long as I was talking about normal things, the world remained normal. I pressed the intercom button again. "Just try to keep your breathing steady. You are doing great." I let go of the button and glanced at the glass. The gray figure was no longer sitting in the chair. In the reflection, it was standing directly behind me. It was so tall its head brushed the drop ceiling. It leaned forward, its smooth, featureless face hovering right next to my ear in the mirror. The cold in the room was absolute. My teeth chattered so hard they ached. I could not move. I stared at the reflection, watching the long, ash-colored fingers slowly reach out toward the back of my chair. I did not turn around. I knew if I turned around, the space behind me would be empty, but the thing in the glass would know I was watching it. I gripped the edge of the desk. I watched the countdown timer on the screen. 10 minutes. 5 minutes. 1 minute. The steady hammering of the machine finally stopped. The scan was over. I did not look at the glass. I stood up from my chair, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. I walked straight to the heavy door that led into the scanning suite. I pushed it open and stepped into the dim, quiet room. The air in here was perfectly normal, room temperature. The contrast was dizzying. I walked over to the scanner and pressed the button to slide the table out of the bore. Mr. Callahan slid out. His eyes were wide, and his jaw was clenched tight. He pulled the earplugs out of his ears with shaking hands. "All done," I said. forcing a cheerful tone. "You can sit up now." He sat up slowly, wrapping his arms around himself. His skin was pale, and his lips had a slight blue tint. He was shivering violently. I reached out to help him off the table, but he pulled away. He looked past me, staring at the thick glass window that looked into my empty control room. He rubbed his arms and looked up at me. "Next time," he whispered, his teeth chattering, "tell the tall doctor to wait outside." He stood right next to me in the tube the whole time, and he was so cold my skin burned. It was the summer of '98, and I was sitting 100 feet above the forest canopy in a glass box. They call it Tower 47. It is a wooden fire lookout perched on the highest ridge in the national park. The job is meant for people who like to be alone. You get a cot, a shortwave radio, a propane stove, and a rotating map instrument called an alidate. You spend your days scanning millions of acres of old-growth pine trees, looking for the faintest wisp of gray smoke. The nearest paved road is a 2-day hike down the mountain. The nearest human being is a ranger stationed 30 miles east. The solitude changes you. After a few weeks, you start talking to yourself. You narrate your coffee making. You read your books out loud just to keep your vocal cords in practice. The silence up here is boundless. It stretches out over the endless green mountains, making you feel like a speck of dust suspended in the sky. It was mid-August, right in the middle of a brutal dry spell. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue. The sun baked the glass walls of the tower, turning the small room into a greenhouse. I had the windows propped open to let in the mountain draft. I was leaning over the map table, plotting out a grid reference for a dried-up creek bed. Out of nowhere, a foul taste coated my tongue. The flavor was sharp and overwhelming. Bitter ash. It coated the roof of my mouth and clung to my tongue, thick and gritty like chalk dust. I coughed, grabbing my metal canteen. I took a long pull of warm water, trying to wash it away, but the taste clung to my teeth. It tasted like scorched pine bark and burnt soil. I set the canteen down and grabbed my binoculars. If you can taste a fire, you are either standing in it, or the wind is carrying the particulate right into your face. I scanned the horizon. North, south, east, west. Nothing. The sky was perfectly clear. There was no haze, no smoke, no sign of combustion anywhere in the vast expanse of the valley. The trees below swayed gently in the breeze. The air coming through the open windows was crisp. Yet, every time I swallowed, I tasted charred wood. I could feel grit grinding between my molars. I picked up a rag and wiped off my tongue. The rag came away clean. The radio on the desk sparked to life. The speaker pushed out a long hiss of static. I walked over to the desk and reached for the receiver. My hand was inches from the plastic when a voice crackled through the speaker. "Dispatch, this is Tower 47. I have a massive crown fire at my coordinates. Please advise." I pulled my hand back. I gazed blankly at the black mesh of the speaker. The voice was mine. It was an exact, chilling duplicate of my cadence, my pitch, and my slight regional drawl. It held the same dry rasp from not speaking enough over the last month. I stopped moving entirely. The bitter taste in my mouth flared up again, making my eyes water. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread. The fact is, radio waves act strange in the mountains. We are taught about statistical anomalies during training. Sometimes, a signal from days ago can bounce off the ionosphere and loop back down. Sometimes frequencies cross and a transmission gets echoed through the network. It happens maybe once in a million broadcasts. It was a statistical dismissal, but it was all I had. I tried to convince myself I had somehow left the mic keyed by accident. The static hissed again. "Dispatch, the fire is on the stairs." I repeat, it is on the stairs. My own voice. Calm. Steady. I did not have a microphone keyed. The radio was sitting untouched. I had to get this on tape. If there was a glitch in the radio system, the rangers down at base camp would need proof to authorize a repair team. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a cheap portable cassette recorder I used to log audio notes. I pressed the two chunky buttons down to start recording and held the device near the radio speaker. The radio stayed silent. Instead, the mimicry shifted. The voice did not come from the speaker this time. It came from the open window. "I'm coming up," my voice said. The sound carried up from the catwalk outside. The tower sits on a wooden frame built of thick timber struts. The only way up is a zigzagging wooden staircase of 120 steps, leading to a heavy iron trapdoor set into the floor of the exterior catwalk. The wood of the stairs groaned. The structure shuddered. Someone was climbing. The pace was slow and deliberate. The sound of a heavy boot shifting the dry timber echoed up the shaft of the tower. I looked down through the glass window, aiming my eyes at the staircase below. I saw nothing. The stairs were empty. The shadows cast by the timber struts were undisturbed. Another step. The wood bowed. The tower swayed a fraction of an inch, reacting to the shifting weight. The sound was closer now, halfway up. I kept the cassette recorder running, my thumb gripping the plastic casing. I backed away from the window. The taste of ash was so potent I started to gag. My stomach churned. Another step. A heavy, localized stress on the pine boards, directly beneath the catwalk. The voice drifted up through the floorboards. "I am right here." I dropped the cassette recorder. It clattered against the wooden floorboards, the tape spindles still spinning. I lunged for the door, throwing myself out onto the narrow exterior catwalk. The mountain wind whipped against my face. The iron trapdoor covering the stairwell opening was propped open with a block of wood. It was meant to stay open so I could evacuate in an emergency. I dropped to my knees on the wooden planks. I kicked the block of wood away and reached for the heavy iron latch to pull the trapdoor shut. Just as my fingers grazed the cold metal of the handle, a hand reached up from the dark gap of the stairwell. The skin was pale and dusted with thick black soot. It gripped the edge of the iron door frame. The fingers were long and dirt-stained, and wrapped around the ring finger, catching the fading afternoon sunlight, was a gold wedding band with a small chip on the bottom edge. My eyes locked onto the chipped gold ring. It was the exact same chip on the exact same ring I was wearing on my own left hand. The fingers curled tight around the iron edge, and the face began to push up from the shadows. The primary data floor lost power without a single warning. 1 second, I was standing in a narrow aisle between two rows of giant server racks, surrounded by the deafening roar of cooling fans and the bright glare of overhead lights. The next second, the fans died. The lights cut out. The pitch black of the windowless room closed around me completely. I work overnight maintenance at a regional data center. The building is a concrete fortress designed to keep millions of dollars of server hardware cool and secure. The rooms are tight enclosures. The server racks stand 8 feet tall, packed close together to maximize airflow. When the power goes down, the silence feels heavy. The air stops circulating, and the heat generated by the machines begins to radiate outward into the dark. I reached into my pocket for my phone to use the flashlight, but as my fingers brushed the screen, the floor suddenly gave way beneath my boots. My sense of balance shattered. The room spun so violently that my knees buckled. It felt like the entire building had tilted on its axis, slanting down at a severe 45-degree angle. I threw my hands out, catching the cold metal grate of the server rack to keep from sliding down the aisle. My brain screamed that I was falling sideways, even though the soles of my boots were planted flat on the concrete. Nausea twisted my stomach. I clamped my eyelids together, trying to reset my inner equilibrium. When I opened my eyes, the emergency backup lights had not come on. The main floor remained dark, but a few yards down the aisle, a small square object emitted a faint, sickly green phosphorescent glow. I clung to the metal rack, fighting the intense sensation of falling. I pulled myself hand over hand down the row of servers toward the faint green light. It was a square maintenance sticker affixed to the side of rack 4A to glow in the dark. Vinyl was designed for emergency readouts. Someone had taken a thick black marker and scrawled a single sentence across the face of the sticker. "If the lights die, do not stand up straight." I read the crude handwriting over and over. There was no company logo. There was no signature. It was just a command. A sharp breeze swept through the top of the aisle. The air in the room was supposed to be stagnant with the HVAC dead, but something was moving above me. It displaced the stale air, pushing a wave of cold draft down over my head. I heard a moist, repetitive clicking. It sounded like long fingernails tapping against the steel top of the server racks. The sound moved fast, darting from the end of the row toward my location. It stayed high, hovering near the drop ceiling. I stopped trying to figure out what caused the power failure or who left the note. A primal urge to survive completely hijacked my brain. I let go of the metal rack and dropped flat onto my stomach. The cold concrete pressed against my chest. The dizzying shift in gravity lessened slightly when I was horizontal. I pressed my cheek against the dusty floor. Something swept through the aisle above me. It moved at head height, filling the narrow space between the racks. I could not see it in the dark, but I felt the immense bulk of it pass over my body. The air pressure changed. A stench like burnt hair and battery acid rolled over me. The wet clicking rattled the steel frames of the servers just inches above where my head had been seconds prior. I started to crawl. I used my elbows and the toes of my boots to drag myself along the floor. I bargained with the rules of the room. If I keep my body below the servers, I survive. If I follow the note, I make it to the door. The aisle was 60 feet long. The clicking sound paced me. It would shoot forward, tapping wildly against the metal racks, then hover directly above me, waiting. Whenever it stopped, I stopped. I held my breath, letting my lungs burn, refusing to give it a target. When the clicking resumed its frantic pacing, I dragged myself forward another few feet. My elbows scraped raw against the concrete. The heat from the dead servers was building, turning the narrow aisle into a roasting oven. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. I focused solely on the sliver of space at the bottom of the exit door at the far end of the room. The clicking grew furious. It swept back and forth across the aisle, thrashing against the metal cages. The thing above me was searching. It was sweeping the empty space where a person walking upright would be. I reached the end of the aisle. The exit door was 3 feet away. The emergency manual breaker switch was mounted on the wall right beside the frame. It was set low, designed to be reached by someone crawling through smoke during a fire. The clicking stopped directly over my back. The burnt hair smell was so thick I could taste it. I threw my arm forward. My fingers found the red plastic handle of the breaker. I yanked it down. The heavy thud of the mechanical switch echoing in the dark was followed by the deafening roar of the backup generators kicking in. The overhead fluorescent panels flickered, buzzing violently before flooding the room with stark white light. The cooling fans screamed to life. I scrambled forward, grabbing the handle of the exit door. I pulled it open and threw myself out into the brightly lit hallway. I rolled onto my back on the hallway carpet, gasping for air. The hallway was empty. The air was cool and clean. I lay there, letting my heart rate slow down, feeling the solid level ground beneath me. The vertigo was gone. The smell was gone. The rule had worked. I was safe. I let out a shaky laugh, wiping the sweat from my eyes with the back of my hand. I sat up and leaned against the wall to catch my breath. I looked through the open doorway back into the server room. The bright fluorescent lights illuminated the long aisles of computer hardware. The enormous metal racks stood in perfect, orderly rows. I pulled my knees to my chest. All 50 server racks in the room, built of thick industrial steel and reinforced aluminum, had been cleanly sliced off. The cut was absolutely level, taking off the top 2 feet of every machine, running parallel to the floor at exact neck height. I was trying to decide between leftover lasagna or grabbing a burger on the drive home. That mundane thought was looping in my head at 50 feet below the surface of the Gulf. Commercial diving is 90% tedious manual labor, done in an environment where human beings have no business existing. My crew was contracted to maintain the intake pipes for a large coastal desalination plant. These structures sit a mile offshore. They are monumental concrete tubes, wide enough to drive a semi-truck through, resting on the ocean floor and covered in jagged barnacles and thick layers of sharp green algae. I wore a standard commercial dive rig. It is not scuba gear. You do not swim. You wear boots weighted with lead and walk on the ocean floor, or you hang suspended by an umbilical tether managed by a tender on the surface vessel. The tether supplies breathing gas, communications, and hot water circulated through a suit to keep your core temperature stable. Your head is locked inside a thick fiberglass dome sealed to a metal neck dam. Water this deep is not the clear, vibrant blue you see in vacation brochures. It is a dense, murky green. Visibility on a good day is about 15 feet. Beyond that 15-foot radius, the water dissolves into a solid wall of opaque shadow. It is an endless expanse of liquid void stretching out in every direction. There are no walls to ground you. There is no ceiling. There is no floor once you detach from the concrete structure. Just open water on every side, silent and freezing. Most people think agoraphobia means being scared of wide-open fields or empty deserts. They've never been underwater. When you are hanging off the side of a concrete pipe, with nothing but miles of open ocean beneath you and around you, the sheer volume of empty space presses against your mind. It makes you feel microscopic. It makes you realize how easily the void could swallow you. I was using a hydraulic scraper to clear a thick crust of marine growth from a secondary intake grate. My metal boots were magnetized to the iron grating to keep the current from sweeping me away. The job requires a numb sort of repetition. You scrape, you move, you scrape again. The only noise is the forced rush of compressed air cycling through the helmet regulators. Inside the dive helmet, your field of view is severely restricted by the faceplate. You only see what is placed directly in front of the glass. To see your periphery, you have to rotate your entire upper body. While dragging the metal scraper across the grate, I caught a shift in the outer edges of my vision. The contrast of the murky water shifted subtly. At the very edge of the fiberglass window, in the distorted curve of the glass, something colossal displaced the ocean. It definitely wasn't a fish or a shadow from the boat. I kept my head facing the intake grate. I let my eyes slide as far to the left as the helmet allowed. Giant, translucent pillars were descending from the unseen surface. They were the color of dirty ice, blending almost seamlessly with the murky green water. They lacked any defined edges, blurring into the surrounding ocean, but their sheer mass pushed the water aside in distinct rolling currents. They moved with a slow, agonizing deliberation, drifting downward just outside my direct line of sight. My chest tightened. The air from the regulator tasted stale and metallic. I closed my eyes tight, trying to fight down the rising alarm. I am a trained professional. I know the hazards of working at depth. Nitrogen narcosis is a constant threat when breathing mixed gases under pressure. We call it the martini effect. The gases saturate your bloodstream and mess with your head, inducing visual hallucinations, paranoia, and a false sense of euphoria or dread. I tried to blame the translucent shapes on nitrogen narcosis. I told myself my mind was just taking the rolling currents of the ocean and assigning them a shape. It was a common occupational hazard. All I needed to do was control my breathing and wait for the chemical imbalance to level out. I stopped scraping. I let the hydraulic tool hang from its lanyard. I locked every muscle in place, boots planted on the iron grate. too scared to even turn my head. I stared straight ahead at the crushed barnacles and the exposed concrete. The sluggish tension in the water grew thicker. The descent of the pillars did not stop. In the frayed edges of my vision, they continued to glide downward, towering columns of pale, gelatinous mass extending deep into the abyss below me. They were wider than the concrete intake pipes. They were wider than the surface vessel. The umbilical tether connecting me to the surface went slack. Usually, the tether maintains a slight pulsing tension, pulling gently with the swell of the waves high above. The slack meant the surface vessel was no longer pulling. It meant the ocean above me had stopped moving. It meant the ocean above him. It meant the ocean above me had stopped moving. A zin above me had stopped moving. I stood paralyzed on the grate. The extreme isolation of the open water amplified the sensory deprivation. The only input I had was the sight of the concrete inches from my face and the terrible, silent descent of the pillars in my periphery. I took a deep, shaky breath, letting the compressed air fill my lungs, hoping the extra oxygen would clear the nitrogen from my brain. The pillars stopped descending. They hovered in the peripheral gloom. The water pressure around my suit changed, shifting from a uniform squeeze to a directed, localized compression, as if the ocean itself was leaning in to inspect me. I could not maintain the denial any longer. I couldn't stand not knowing anymore, training or no training. I turned my head. I rotated my neck, pointing the front faceplate of the helmet directly into the open expanse of the ocean where the pillars had been. The water was empty. There were no columns of ice. There were no translucent shapes. Just the same murky green water, stretching out into nothingness. The digital pressure gauge mounted on the chest manifold of my suit flickered. The numbers dropped from a steady 50 feet of pressure to absolute zero. Absolute zero pressure means you are in a vacuum. It means you are no longer underwater. But the green murk still pressed against my gloss faceplate. The ocean around me went dead still. The ambient drift of marine snow froze in place. The tiny particles of debris suspended in the water stopped moving, locked in a frozen diorama. The green murk in front of my faceplate began to part. An enormous pale eyelid, textured like wet rotted leather and large enough to eclipse my entire field of view, slid downward from the gloom, blinking shut just inches from my mask. I let go of the iron grate. The 12th floor button illuminated on its own. I stood in the center of the cramped elevator cab, a clipboard resting against my hip. I work for a state regulatory agency, inspecting commercial elevators. People view elevators as magic rooms that transport them from the lobby to their office. I view them as metal cages suspended by braided steel ropes inside dark, vertical concrete tunnels. You spend long, odd hours inside these metal boxes, usually in the middle of the night when the buildings are empty and the testing will not disrupt the tenants. The air inside a hoistway always smells the same. It is a distinct mixture of heated machine grease, ozone from the electrical contacts, and decades of accumulated dust. Tonight, I was running compliance checks on a modernization project in a mid-rise corporate park. The building had 12 floors. I had spent the last 3 hours checking the buffer, springs in the basement pit, and verifying the governor switches on the roof. The final step was a routine floor-to-floor functional test inside the cab. The cab was claustrophobically small, designed to hold maybe 8 people maximum. The walls were lined with dark faux wood paneling and cheap scratched mirrors that reflected my tired face back at me from 4 different angles. I had just pressed the button for the lobby. The car was supposed to descend. Instead, the plastic button for the 12th floor lit up with a bright amber glow. Then, a 13th button, one that did not exist on the panel a second prior, illuminated right above it. I was still staring at the extra button when the cab went into a free fall. A crushing pressure slammed into my chest, forcing the breath from my lungs. The sensation was identical to the extreme G-force of a roller coaster entering a vertical dive. My balance failed me. I grabbed the brass handrail bolted to the wall to keep from collapsing onto the linoleum floor. The metal cage rattled violently, the guide shoes screaming against the steel rails in the hoistway. The digital floor indicator above the door flickered wildly, cycling through numbers at a blinding speed. Fear started to set in, but I fought hard to keep my imagination from running wild. I held onto the handrail like it was the only solid thing left in the world and forced out a dry laugh. "Must be my lucky day," I muttered to the empty cab, leaning into denial through humor. My mind immediately blamed a catastrophic failure of the control board. A wiring glitch sending phantom signals to the display and the motor room. The braking system was just catching the car after a brief slip. Elevators have multiple redundant safety systems. They do not just free fall. The crushing pressure vanished as abruptly as it began. The cab leveled out with a smooth, silent glide. The amber light behind the impossible 13th button blinked off. The stainless steel doors slid apart. I braced myself, expecting to see the concrete wall of the hoistway or the dark, unfinished sub-basement. Instead, the doors opened into a pristine, brightly lit lobby. I loosened my grip on the handrail. It was the ground floor lobby I had walked through hours ago to meet the building manager. The polished marble floors reflected the recessed lighting. The large potted ferns sat in the corners. The curved security desk stood empty near the glass entrance doors. I stepped out of the cab, my boots squeaking on the marble. The relief was palpable. The control board had just scrambled the floor indicator during a rough descent. I was on the ground floor. I walked toward the glass entrance doors, eager to get out to my truck and log the fail code for the motor drive. As I passed the security desk, I glanced at the digital directory board mounted on the wall. The screen displays the names of the corporate tenants and their corresponding floor numbers. I stopped walking. The directory board was divided into 12 sections, one for each floor. Under Suite 100, the text read, Arthur Vance. Under Suite 200, the text read, Arthur Vance. Under Suite 300, the text read, Arthur Vance. I glared at the screen in disbelief. My name was listed for every single office in the building, every floor, every suite. The air in the lobby felt stagnant, devoid of the slight draft that usually comes from the revolving exterior doors. I looked at the glass entrance. Outside, there was no street. There were no streetlights. There was just a flat, impenetrable wall of gray static pressing against the glass. I turned around. The elevator doors were still open, waiting. I bolted. I dropped the clipboard on the marble floor and sprinted for the fire exit stairwell behind the security desk. I pushed the heavy metal bar. The door swung open, revealing the raw concrete steps. I threw myself into the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. I sprinted without looking back, completely forgetting about the testing equipment I left in the elevator. The descent was a blur of gray concrete, yellow safety paint, and the frantic echo of my own boots. I ran until my lungs burned and my thighs ached. I hit the final landing, slammed my shoulder into the exit door, and burst out into the alley behind the building. The cold night air hit my face. The smell of damp asphalt and distant exhaust fumes filled my lungs. I stumbled forward, resting my hands on my knees, gasping for breath. The alley was normal. The distant glow of the city skyline painted the clouds orange. I walked briskly to the surface lot where I had parked my agency truck. I unlocked the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. I hit the manual locks. Getting back inside the truck brought me back to reality. The scent of stale coffee and vinyl seats was exactly what I needed to calm down. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel, waiting for my pulse to settle. I had escaped. A panic attack brought on by exhaustion and toxic fumes in the hoistway. That made the most sense. I had hallucinated the directory board. I sat back against the headrest, taking a long, shuddering breath. I reached out to turn the ignition key. My eyes fell on the dashboard. Sitting directly on top of the dashboard, inside the locked cab, was the parking lot receipt I had printed when I arrived at 8 o'clock that evening. I picked up the small square of thermal paper. The printed text from the machine was gone. Instead, scrawled across the blank receipt in blue ink, was tomorrow's date, written flawlessly in my own cursive handwriting. It was 4 in the morning in the Yukon, and I was telling myself out loud that I was awake. I muttered the words to the empty cab, watching the headlights cut a narrow tunnel of white through the endless dark. I drive an 18-wheeler over frozen lakes. For 2 months out of the year, the ice gets thick enough to support 50 tons of steel and freight. It is a lifeline for the diamond mines up north. It is also the most unforgiving stretch of driving on Earth. Out here, the environment wants you dead. The temperature outside the door is 40 below zero. If the truck breaks down, you have about 10 minutes before the cold seeps through the insulation and starts killing you. You can't stop or speed up. You just have to maintain a steady rhythm. When you drive a loaded rig over a frozen lake, the weight of the truck pushes down on the ice, displacing the water underneath. It creates a slow-moving wave beneath the surface. If you drive too fast, you catch up to your own wave, and the pressure blows the ice out right in front of your bumper. If you drive too slow, the ice bows under the stationary weight, and you sink. You have to lock into a specific speed, usually around 15 miles per hour, and hold it there for hundreds of miles. I was on my 14th hour of driving. The heater blasted dry air across my shins. My eyes burned, feeling like they were coated in sand. Fatigue out here is a tangible thing. It wraps around your mind and starts pulling at the edges of your vision. Truckers call it seeing the black dog. Your brain gets so desperate for stimulation in the dark white void that it starts inventing things. Shadows turn into animals. Snowdrifts look like people walking on the shoulder. I wipe my tired eyes, straining to see the yellow marker stakes planted in the snowbanks along the edge of the ice. Then, without warning, an out-of-place scent filled the cab. My cab usually smells like stale coffee, diesel fuel, and unwashed work clothes. This scent was different. It pushed through the dry heat of the vents. It was the overwhelming odor of wet potting soil and rotting lilies. It was thick. It smelled like the air inside a greenhouse that had been locked shut for a week. The sweetness of the decaying flowers was nauseating, mixing with the dark, rich scent of damp earth. I rolled down my window a fraction of an inch, thinking something had died in the engine block, and the heater was pulling the scent inside. The brutal Arctic wind screamed through the crack, throwing a handful of ice crystals into my face. The air outside smelled of absolute nothingness. Just frozen ozone and frost. I rolled the window back up. The smell of wet dirt and rotting lily remained inside the cab. It made no sense. The ground outside had been frozen solid beneath 5 feet of snow for half a year. There was no wet earth out here. There was no life. I wiped my nose with the back of my glove. I blamed the fatigue. I was hallucinating smells now. I just needed to focus on the road. Keep the speed steady. 15 miles per hour. Keep the RPMs in the green zone. The CB radio mounted above the dashboard crackled. We keep the radios on channel 19 to talk to other drivers on the ice. It is a safety protocol. You announce your mile marker so no one comes speeding down a narrow portage and hits you head on. The radio had been dead silent for 3 hours. Static hissed from the speaker. It was a steady rising hiss, like the sound of static electricity building up. Then a voice spoke. David. My stomach dropped. I took my foot off the throttle for a fraction of a second before catching myself and pressing back down to maintain my speed. It was a woman's voice. It was clear, lacking the usual garbled distortion of a distant radio signal. It sounded like she was sitting in the passenger seat next to me. "David, listen to me." I focused on the radio receiver. The green indicator light was not flashing. No one was transmitting. The voice belonged to my mother. She had been dead for 6 years. I remembered her funeral clearly because it was the last time I smelled this exact combination of rich turned earth and excessive floral arrangements. The memory made the scent in the cab spike, becoming so intense I had to breathe through my mouth. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands went raw. Exhaustion out here makes you imagine things. I knew what was happening. I was falling asleep with my eyes open. My brain was digging into my subconscious, pulling up old grief and projecting it into the silent cab to keep me stimulated. It was a waking nightmare. "The ice is gone ahead," the voice said. It was calm. It held the gentle, authoritative tone she used to use when I was a child about to touch a hot stove. "You need to stop the truck, David." I refused to reach for the radio microphone. I refused to answer. If you talk back to the hallucinations, you give them root. You lose your grip on reality. I had to protect my own sanity. I locked my eyes on the dashboard dials, desperate for a distraction. I muttered a string of curses, shaking my head to clear the creeping madness. "Oil pressure is steady at 40, I said, staring at the gauges on the dash. "Coolant temperature is optimal. Speed is 15. Gear is low range. We are driving. Everything is fine. David," the calm voice echoed from the unlit radio. "The water is black. Do not drive into the dark." "I am in 7th gear," I yelled over the static. "I am going to shift to 8th. Depress clutch. Move the stick. Release clutch. Watch the RPMs." I performed the motions, locking my eyes on the illuminated dials. The transmission whined, a solid mechanical sound that belonged to the real world. I used it as an anchor. I kept my vision focused strictly on the 10 feet of illuminated snow directly in front of my bumper. I would not look out into the dark. I would not acknowledge the voice. The smell of dirt got so thick I could practically chew on it. "Please stop," she whispered. I clenched my jaw and began counting backward from 100 out loud. I just needed some kind of mental wall between my conscious mind and the voice that had no business being in this cab. I drove like this for another 40 minutes. The radio hissed a few more times, but the voice faded, swallowed by my relentless recitation of mechanical facts. Eventually, the yellow marker stakes indicated a widening in the road. It was a designated safe pull-off zone built over a shallow gravel bar, meant for trucks to park and let their engines idle while the drivers slept. I guided the rig onto the packed snow of the pull-off. I eased the brakes, letting the heavy rig roll to a gentle stop. I pulled the yellow parking brake valve. The air hissed out, locking the wheels in place. The silence that followed was overwhelmingly heavy. The engine idled with a low rumble, but the terrible tension of the ice road was gone. I was parked on solid ground. The smell of wet soil and lily was fading. The radio was dead silent. I leaned my head back against the seat, finally able to relax my grip on the wheel. The hallucination had broken. I had worked through the fatigue by sticking to the routine. My chest finally stopped heaving quite as hard. I felt foolish, but mostly I just felt bone-tired. I had to step outside. I wanted the brutal cold to shock my system and clear the sleep deprivation from my head before climbing into the sleeper berth. I grabbed my insulated parka and pulled on my thick gloves. I pushed the heavy metal door open. The wind hit me like a solid wall. It was a dry, biting cold that stole the breath from my lungs. I climbed down the side steps, my boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. The night was huge and indifferent. The sky was dusted with a million sharp stars. I walked around to the front of the truck to check the grill. On the ice roads, snow can pack into the radiator fins and cause the engine to overheat despite the freezing temperatures. It is a mandatory check. I shined my flashlight at the heavy chrome grille. Wedged deep between the metal bars, crushed against the frozen mesh of the radiator, was a large, mangled object. I stepped closer, narrowing my eyes against the glare of the flashlight beam. It was a funeral bouquet. The plastic wrapping was shredded, but the stems were still intact, tangled in the chrome. The crushed petals of white lily were frozen solid against the metal. Packed around the stems, smeared across the front bumper and frozen into the ice, was a thick layer of rich, dark potting soil. I looked down at the crushed flowers. The fear didn't feel supernatural anymore. It felt cold and mundane, and somehow that was worse. The smell in the cab had not been a hallucination. The voice on the radio had not been my mother. I had fallen asleep hours ago, drifting onto the shoulder near a town line, and I had plowed straight through a roadside memorial cross before correcting my steering, dragging the debris with me across the ice. The heavy plastic lid of the flatbed scanner slammed down, sealing a brittle piece of paper against the glass. I pressed the green button on the console. The machine whirred to life, the bright light of the scanning bar tracking slowly from left to right. I watched the computer monitor as the digital image of an 1890s property deed rendered pixel by pixel. My job title is digital archivist, which is a very polite way of saying I scan old paper in the dark. The university library houses its historical archives in the sub-basement, 3 floors below street level. It is a sprawling maze of high-density mobile shelving. The shelves are towering metal units that roll on tracks built into the concrete floor. You turn a crank on the end panel, and the shelves part to create a narrow aisle. When you are standing in an aisle, you are walled in by 12-foot high steel racks packed tight with acid-free boxes. The basement has no natural light. We keep the overhead fluorescent tubes turned off in the stacks to prevent UV degradation of the ink. The only illumination comes from the small desk lamp at my workstation, which sits at the very end of the main corridor. I pulled the lid up, removed the property deed, and placed the next fragile sheet onto the glass. I closed the lid and hit the green button. From deep inside the pitch-black stacks, a sound echoed. The sound was wet and ragged, like someone tearing a thick stack of old parchment paper in half by hand. I paused, my hand hovering over the mouse. The basement is always full of ambient noise. The concrete walls echo the vibrations of the subway passing 2 blocks away. The pipes groan, but this sound was distinct. It had texture. I looked down the main corridor. The narrow aisles between the rolling shelves formed vertical slices of absolute darkness. Working alone underground messes with your head. I guess the old HVAC system was rattling again. The building was over 100 years old. The ventilation ducts running above the drop ceiling often rattled. A slipping fan belt in one of the air handlers could easily mimic a tearing sound. It was just rubber scraping on rusted metal. I clicked save on the computer and loaded the next document. 12 seconds later, the exact same sound echoed from the dark. A damp, ragged tear. It lasted for 2 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I kept my eyes on the monitor. A slipping belt makes a rhythmic noise. It loops. The regularity of the sound proved my theory. The fan was catching on a bad bearing every 12 seconds. I focused on the digital progress bar moving across my screen. The work was tedious, but it required attention. I could not afford to tear the original documents by rushing. Another 12 seconds passed. The wet tears sounded again. I frowned, adjusting the brightness on my monitor. The rhythm was consistent, but the acoustic quality was wrong for overhead vents. The sound was not coming from the ceiling. It was coming from the floor level, deep inside aisle 7, about 50 feet away. I reached for the next paper, sliding it onto the glass. I pressed the button. 10 seconds passed. The tearing sound rang out again. It was louder this time. And it did not come from aisle 7. It came from aisle 6. My fingers went stiff against the plastic edge of the scanner. The logic of a failing fan belt began to fray. Vents do not move. They do not travel down the rows of shelves. I stayed motionless, watching the digital image render on the screen. There is an uncanny valley for sound, too. Hearing a noise that is almost mechanical, but has a slight biological wetness to it, makes your brain completely reject it. It sets off a deep, instinctive alarm. I waited. I counted in my head. 8 seconds. The sound came again. It was closer. Aisle 5. The tear was louder, possessing a distinct fibrous rip, followed by a soft, wet exhalation, as if whatever was making the noise had to force air out of a constricted throat to do it. I felt a cold sweat prickle along my hairline. The muscles in my back locked up. I froze, keeping my eyes glued to the glowing rectangle of my monitor. I almost looked. I could feel the urge to turn my head and peer down the dark corridor, pulling at my neck like a physical weight. But I knew if I looked into the shadows, the reality of the situation would lock into place. As long as I kept my eyes on the software interface, the sound could remain a strange acoustic anomaly. I clicked the mouse, creating a new digital folder, performing the task with mechanical precision. 6 seconds. The tear resonated from aisle 4. It was so close now I could hear the subtle shifting of weight on the concrete floor just before the sound occurred. This wasn't just repeating anymore. It was closing the gap between sounds a little more each time, like it knew exactly how much runway it had left. 4 seconds. Aisle 3. Just 20 feet from my desk. The wet ripping noise vibrated against the metal end panels of the shelves. My breathing became shallow. I wanted to stand up and run to the emergency exit stairwell, but the stairwell was located past aisle 1. I would have to run directly toward the sound in the dark. I forced myself to stare only at the monitor. The property deed on the monitor blurred into a white square as my vision swam with pure terror. I gripped the armrests of my chair. 2 seconds. Aisle 2. The tearing sound was deafening, echoing right off the metal shelf a few feet to my left. I screwed my eyes tightly closed, turning my face away from the screen. The darkness in my own head was safer than the darkness in the room. I reached my right hand out blindly, feeling across the laminated wood of the desk, aiming for the switch on the base of the small desk lamp. I wanted more light. I wanted to flood the corridor. My hand moved past the keyboard. As I groped blindly for the switch, my hand brushed against something resting on the edge of my desk. It was damp, feeling like cold, raw meat, and it was expanding and contracting with a slow, steady rhythm. The wet, deafening screech of tearing paper sounded directly next to my ear. The Mojave wind never really stops. It just changes direction. It blows a constant stream of fine grit across the valley, coating everything in a thin layer of beige dust. I work as a maintenance technician for a commercial solar farm out near the California border. The facility is enormous. It consists of over 400,000 photovoltaic panels arranged in perfect, symmetrical rows that stretch across 3 square miles of flat desert dirt. My job involves driving a small utility truck up and down these endless rows, replacing faulty wiring harnesses and fixing the motorized tracker arms. The panels are designed to tilt throughout the day, following the arc of the sun to maximize energy absorption. When a tracker motor burns out, a panel gets stuck pointing the wrong way. It was late October. The sun was getting low, dipping toward the jagged silhouette of the distant mountains. The sky turned a bruised shade of purple and orange. I was working on a row near the far western edge of the array, miles away from the main control building. Out here, surrounded by all those rows, you start to feel impossibly small. You are surrounded by a sea of black glass reflecting the dying light. I was kneeling in the dirt with a socket wrench, tightening a pivot bolt on a stubborn motor housing. My sleeves were rolled up. The desert cools down fast once the sun starts to set, and I was looking forward to turning on the heater in my truck. Then, as if someone flipped a switch, the relentless wind died. It didn't die down. The gale just vanished in a single heartbeat. The air went stagnant and dead. The sudden silence was unnatural, removing the familiar hum of wind rushing through the metal brackets of the solar arrays. A few seconds later, the skin on my forearms began to burn. It felt like holding my bare arms over an open oven door. The heat was intense, localized, and aggressive. Every hair on my arms curled up from the heat. My skin grew tight and hot to the touch. I dropped the wrench and rubbed my arms, confused. The ambient air temperature was dropping into the low 60s. There was no source of heat nearby. The solar panels themselves do not radiate heat like this. I stood up and took a step back from the array. The burning sensation lessened slightly. I looked down at the dirt. The setting sun was casting long, deep shadows from the rows of panels. The shadows stretched out across the ground, pointing east, forming rigid parallel bars of dark gray over the cracked earth. I looked at my own shadow. It stretched out beside the panels, mimicking my posture. Then, the shadow cast by the solar panel 10 feet to my left began to move. The sun was fixed in the sky. The metal panel was bolted to its concrete footing, but the long rectangular shadow it cast onto the dirt was warping. The edges of the dark shape blurred and elongated, pooling outward like spilled ink. It crawled across the dry earth, moving perpendicular to the rest of the shadows, heading straight toward the toe of my work boots. My arms flared with heat again. The closer the warped shadow crept, the hotter the air around me felt. The skin on my neck felt like it was baking under a magnifying glass. We have a thick safety handbook for working in the deep desert. Section 4 covers wildlife encounters. The area is home to mountain lions, wild dogs, and coyotes. The rules are hammered into us from day one. You never run. Running triggers a prey drive. You find a secure shelter, you barricade yourself, and you wait for the threat to leave. My mind went totally blank in the face of the impossible. I forced myself to treat the anomaly like a feral animal. Do not run. Break line of sight. Seek shelter. My utility truck was parked about 20 yards down the row. I turned and walked toward it, keeping my pace brisk but measured. I did not sprint. I kept my eyes focused on the white metal door of the truck. The heat on my back grew searing. The fabric of my cotton shirt felt like it was fresh out of a dryer, pressing uncomfortably hot against my spine. I glanced down at the dirt beside me. The shadow was following me. It had detached itself from the base of the solar array and was sliding across the ground, a shapeless mass of darkness that ignored the angle of the sun. It moved with a smooth, predatory glide. I reached the truck. I grabbed the door handle, but it was locked. My keys were sitting on the passenger seat. I had left the window rolled down to keep the cab from turning into an oven during the afternoon. The warped shadow surged forward, sweeping over the dirt with incredible speed. I did not have time to reach through the window and unlock the door. I threw myself to the ground and scrambled under the chassis of the truck. The space beneath the vehicle was cramped. I pressed my back against the warm asphalt of the access road, pulling my knees up to my chest. The truck cast a wide, solid shadow of its own, shielding me in a block of normal, mundane darkness. I waited. The rogue shadow hit the edge of the truck shadow. The ambient temperature beneath the chassis spiked. It felt like someone had opened a blast furnace inches from my face. Perspiration beaded on my brow, the salt burning my vision. The dry heat cracked my lips. I watched the edge of the dirt, where the sunlight met the shade of the truck. The unnatural darkness tested the perimeter. It swept back and forth along the line of sunlight, a thick, rippling void trying to find the way in. It could not cross into the truck's shadow. It needed the contrast of light to exist. I clamped my hands over my mouth to muffle my breathing. I lay there on the hard ground, baking in the suffocating heat, watching the shapeless mass pace back and forth just inches from my boots. I stayed under the truck for 45 minutes. I waited until the sun fully disappeared behind the mountains. As the twilight faded into true night, The long shadows of the solar arrays dissolved into a uniform darkness. Without the light to define it, the rogue shadow lost its shape. It thinned out and vanished into the ambient gloom of the desert night. The blistering heat evaporated, replaced by the biting chill of the evening breeze. I crawled out from under the truck, my clothes soaked in sweat and coated in dirt. I reached through the open window, grabbed my keys, and unlocked the door. I climbed into the cab and started the engine. I drove away from the facility faster than the speed limit allowed. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead. I kept my eyes off the rearview mirror and ignored the endless rows of black glass fading into the dark, desperate for the safety of four solid walls. The drive back to my house took an hour. I live in a small single-story ranch house on the outskirts of town. I parked in the driveway, walked up to the front porch, and unlocked the deadbolt. I stepped inside and slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind me. I locked the deadbolt. I locked the chain. The house was quiet and cool. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen made me feel safe again. The familiar smell of old coffee and laundry detergent washed away the memory of the baking desert air. The routine of coming home worked its magic. The adrenaline subsided. I had survived a strange environmental anomaly. The heat out here makes you see things. The heat distorts light. It was over. I closed my eyes for a second, feeling the tight knot in my chest loosen. I reached out and flipped a switch on the wall, turning on the bright overhead lights of the living room. I looked down to untie my work boots. The bright bulbs illuminated the polished hardwood floor. I looked at the space around my feet. My boots cast no shadow. The floor around me was brightly, uniformly lit, devoid of any dark shapes. Then I looked a few feet to my right, just past the edge of the living room rug. A twisted, jagged silhouette, shaped like something crouched and hungry, was scorched permanently into the wood grain. Just sign here on the bottom line. I slid the clipboard across the polished granite counter. The security guard blinked heavy, sleep-deprived eyes, took my pen, and scribbled his initials on the delivery manifest. He handed it back, leaned his head against the high back of his chair, and closed his eyes. Working as a vending machine restocker on the graveyard shift is a job built on invisibility. I service the sprawling corporate office parks downtown between midnight and 6 in the morning. The goal is to arrive, fill the machines with stale pastries and soda, empty the coin trays, and leave without ever being noticed by the daytime staff. You navigate a labyrinth of sterile hallways, freight elevators, and windowless break rooms. The environments are aggressively boring. They are places designed for brief, forced social interaction, but at 3 in the morning, they feel like abandoned space stations. I loaded 2 heavy cardboard boxes of snacks onto my hand truck. The guard at the front desk was already asleep. The lobby was cavernous and quiet, lit by the harsh glare of recessed lighting. I pushed the metal hand truck toward the double doors leading to the basement level. The rubber wheels squeaked against the tile floor. My route tonight required me to service the main employee cafeteria, located at the end of a long subterranean corridor. I pushed through the doors and started down the hall. The walls were painted a lifeless eggshell white. The floor was covered in tight gray carpet. The corridor stretched straight ahead for about 200 feet, ending at the glass doors of the cafeteria. There were no side doors, no intersecting hallways, just a straight, narrow tunnel. About halfway down the hall, the temperature changed. The corporate buildings are always kept cold. The air conditioning runs non-stop to protect the server rooms on the upper floors. But as I pushed the hand truck past a decorative potted plant, a wall of blistering heat hit my face. The heat was dry and violent, the kind that made my skin feel tight within seconds. The moisture in my eyes evaporated in seconds. My throat clamped shut. The air was so hot it felt heavy, thick enough to make my lungs struggle to pull in a full breath. I stopped walking. I let go of the metal handle of the hand truck. The steel was already growing warm to the touch. I looked down the long corridor toward the cafeteria doors. Standing directly in front of the glass doors, facing me, was a figure. It had not been there a moment ago. I had a clear line of sight down the entire hall. It had simply appeared in the space of a heartbeat. The figure was tall. It was wrapped in thick, dark material that looked like charred canvas, masking any discernible features. It stood entirely still. It didn't breathe or shift its weight at all. It was as rigid as a statue carved from burnt wood. The heat radiating from that end of the hall was unbearable. The heat dried my forehead. The instant sweat tried to form, leaving a thin, salty crust instead. My eyes began to sting from the intense dryness. I didn't even try to rationalize it or look for hidden vents. Every alarm bell in my head went off, screaming that the figure at the end of the hall was extremely dangerous. It was wrong, and I had to get out of there. The dry air forced my eyes to blink. I closed my eyelids for a fraction of a second to moisten my corneas. When my eyes opened, the figure was no longer standing by the cafeteria doors. It was 20 feet closer. It had not walked. It had not run. The posture remained frozen, the dark, charred canvas draped in the exact same folds. It had simply bridged the distance during the split second my eyes were shut. The ambient heat in the hallway spiked. The gray carpet beneath the figure's feet began to smolder, sending thin wisps of acrid smoke into the air. Absolute terror seized my chest. I backed away, my heel catching on the wheel of my hand truck. I stumbled, fighting to keep my balance. My eyes burned. The urge to blink was overwhelming. I forced my eyes wide open, staring at the statue-still entity. "Hey," I rasped, my voice sounding like crushed dry leaves. It did not respond. It just stood there in the corridor, radiating a lethal wave of heat. I took another step back. My vision blurred as tears tried to form to protect my eyes from the dry air, but the heat baked the moisture away. I could not hold them open any longer. The sting was too sharp. I blinked. The heat slammed into me like a physical blow. The figure was now 50 feet away. The smell of scorching synthetic carpet fibers filled the hall. The paint on the wall nearest to the entity began to bubble and peel, curling into brown flakes. I did not wait for the next blink. I let go of the hand truck, leaving the boxes of snacks behind. I spun around and sprinted back the way I came. I ran toward the lobby doors, keeping my eyes fixed on the exit. The hallway felt miles long. The heat chased me, pressing against my back, singeing the fabric of my uniform shirt. I could feel the temperature rising with every step I took, meaning the thing was closing the distance behind me every time my heavy footfalls forced me to blink. I hit the lobby double doors with my shoulder, bursting through into the cool, conditioned air of the reception area. The sudden drop in temperature was a shock to my system. I gasped, filling my lungs with cold air. The security guard was still slumped in his chair behind the granite desk. I did not stop to wake him. The building wasn't safe anymore. I had to get outside. I ran across the lobby, my boots slipping on the polished marble. I reached the main entrance, slammed my hands against the crash bar of the glass door, and shoved myself out into the night. The city air was humid and cool. The sound of distant traffic helped snap me out of it. I stumbled down the concrete steps, putting a safe distance between myself and the entrance. I stopped near the curb and doubled over, gulping down air. The terror began to recede, replaced by the rush of survival. I had made it out. I had fled the confined space before whatever that thing was could trap me in the hall. I stood up straight and looked back at the building. The tall glass panels at the entrance offered a clear view into the brightly lit lobby. I expected to see the charred figure pressed against the glass, trapped inside the lobby. The lobby was empty. The figure was gone. I focused on the security desk. The guard was no longer slumped in his chair. He was standing on the customer side of the granite counter, facing the exterior glass doors. His dark blue uniform was scorched black. The fabric was melted to his arms. His skin was a bright, blistering red, covered in wet, peeling burns. He stood completely rigid, his arms hanging stiffly at his sides. He stared out through the glass directly at me, his eyes wide open, unblinking. These spaces prove that the most terrifying things do not hide in the dark. They hide in our routines, waiting for us to drop our guard. If you want to know what happens when the horrors follow you straight into the emergency room, click here for 14 true horror stories told by ICU nurses.